Hi, everyone. So, in the last few weeks, we've looked at the Barnum tradition of advertising, and we've also looked at patent medicines, areas of advertising that were prolific. There was a lot of advertising, especially on the patent medicine side. It came to sort of define advertising, sometimes in a negative way. Today, we're going to look at advertising that comes out of corporations. Advertising that come out of corporations like Kellogg's or Procter and Gamble, and these are some of the more so-called legitimate corporations that were coming on the scene in the late 1800s, and they were very much trying to restore the image of advertising to take away that Barnum reputation that we've talked about before. So the question about professionalization of advertising is also wrapped up with the issue of the legitimacy of advertising. You might recall that at the start of the course, I showed you this Gallup poll from 2017, which basically, when they asked people about professions in terms of honesty and integrity, what it showed was that at the top were nurses and doctors, and at the bottom were advertisers and used car salesmen and politicians, right? So it speaks to the issue of the ongoing legitimacy problem of advertising. And so what we're going to be looking at are ways in which some of these early corporate advertisers tried to deal with that problem and the reputation, the social legitimacy of advertising. And also, at the core of the book that you're reading for this course, The Ad Man's Dilemma, the legitimacy issue for advertising is at the core of that title of the book, right? So the dilemma is that for advertisers to be good at their work, they often have to lie, right? Sometimes it's embellishing the truth, or sometimes it's outright lying. So to be good at your trade, to work in advertising, to be good as an advertiser, often that means lying. And so, on the other hand, though, people might feel that they have some kind of requirement to sort of speak the truth in their lives, right? There's a kind of moral imperative about being truthful with people. We think of being truthful as a kind of virtue. And so it's this kind of contradiction, this paradox that exists in the lives of advertisers, the kind of dilemma, which in the respect of this book is the ad man's dilemma. So we'll be kind of moving through those kinds of ideas in the course in general as we go along. But today we're going to focus more on this new category of advertisers that comes along, right? And tries to put the patent medicine tradition of advertising behind them. So what you see in this period, beginning probably with the early 1900s, is you start to see various groups taking a more forceful opposition to patent medicine advertising. On the one hand, you saw this from the professional medical community, so this could be like the American Medical Association or the Canadian Medical Association in Canada. And these were people from the allopathic medical tradition that we talked about, medical doctors and the like. And they were taking a more forceful position in terms of criticizing patent medicines as being dubious products, as being harmful, and the rest. So that's one area of criticism that patent medicines were facing. The other was coming from magazine publishers. We talked before about how newspapers relied heavily on patent medicine advertising. But in fact, many magazine publishers did not take patent medicine advertising. So what that means is that they were freer to do investigative journalism with respect to patent medicines, and many of them did, like Collier's and Ladies' Home Journal. And they published articles that were critical of the patent medicine industry, citing all kinds of problems around public health, consumer fraud, and the rest. And the third group that were more critical of patent medicines is the group that we're going to look at today mostly. And these are kind of corporate mass advertisers. Companies like Procter and Gamble, companies like Kellogg's and Heinz, companies that we know today that were consumer goods manufacturers. And these companies came to realize the importance of advertising and marketing for their business success. And so for them, they had a vested interest in ensuring that advertising had a more positive reputation in society. Okay, so essentially those are the things, especially the latter point about the corporate mass advertisers. That's what we're going to focus on more today. So as I mentioned before, Here are some examples of these companies: Campbell's Soup, Procter and Gamble, uh, Kodak, Gillette. Now, Coca-Cola is a really interesting example because it starts as a patent medicine in the 1880s, 1886. It's essentially a product that's touted as a kind of pain relief formula for people experiencing chronic pain, often those Civil War veterans that I mentioned before. But the product transitions into being a pleasure drink by the 1910s or 20s. So one thing that happens, the coca leaf ingredient in Coca-Cola is removed in the early 1900s. And so it's no longer having that kind of claim to having some kind of pain relief in the form of coca leaf. But by the 1910s and 20s, it's very much an advertising-oriented company, and it's very much touting itself as a pleasure drink. So these are some of the examples of these modern mass advertisers, these corporations. And again, the issue for them is going to be tied up with shoring up the legitimacy, the social legitimacy of advertising. Just to give you like an example of that, when the Harvard Business School in 1929, it gave a gold medal prize for advertising, and it gave it to the publisher of Ladies' Home Journal, which was Cyrus Curtis. And in doing that, what they sort of praised him for what they said was his pioneering high standards of censorship. Now, by censorship, what they mean is that he wasn't running patent medicine ads in his magazines. And they also said this. They said he rejected those patent medicine advertisements, which in turn furthered the welfare of advertising by promoting public confidence in its honesty and its credibility, right? Distancing yourself from patent medicines becomes a way to shore up the social acceptance and legitimacy of advertising. Now you can see here from this slide, it's just putting some numbers up, and the first one looks at how much advertising spending happens in the U.S., and in this case it's 1880. You can see it's around $100 million. By 1919, 1.4 billion. So that's a 14-fold increase in the amount of money spent on advertising in American media. So it's a huge increase, and we'll look at factors explaining that. Why was there such an increase in advertising spending over these decades? And another number you should look at here is the number that looks at what percentage of a newspaper or magazine's revenues come from advertising. And you can see that in 1880 it's around 44%. By 1920 it's 2/3. So what this means is that if you are a newspaper, and you can have different sources of revenue, right? You could get it from advertising. You could have it from subscribers who, say, pay a weekly or monthly fee to get the newspaper. Or you could get revenue from newspapers that are sold at a newsstand, for example, right? Different sources of revenue. But what you see here is that what becomes the most important single source of that revenue by the 1920s is advertising. And in that sense, when advertising gets to that level, more than half, or in this case 2/3, newspapers and magazines are effectively no longer in the business of selling their newspapers or magazines to customers. They're really in the business of selling their newspapers. They're selling, what they're doing is they're selling customers to advertisers, right? They're in the business of securing advertisers, and those advertisers typically want certain types of customers, and hence the newspapers are going to be looking for certain types of readers in that sense. So advertising it's not just a matter of it being a different source of revenue, and it's the same as if the revenue was coming from subscribers. It actually changes the way these types of media operate with respect to a dependence on advertising. Okay, so I'm going to give you some broader social and demographic factors that will account for why advertising spending increases so much during these years. You can see here one factor is just population growth. from about 50 million in 1880 to 106 million in 1920. So it more than doubles in the U.S. That in part accounts from immigration. It also just accounts from higher birth rates and lower death rates. People are living longer. For Canada, similar types of growth in population, but of course Canada is 1/10 the size of the U.S., so the numbers would be reflecting that. Population growth, but it's also where people are living that will matter in terms of advertising. So you can see here the percentage of people that were living in designated urban areas in 1880, 28%. By 1920, it's more than half. Now keep in mind too that an urban area at this time is defined as a place of 2,500 or more people. So you could be living in a town of 3,000 people, and you might think it's sort of a small town in some respects, but in fact it would constitute an urban setting. So that's an interesting factor, right? Because one of the things we'll be discovering in this course is that when you live in an urban area, say in a city, you are more likely to buy goods than if you live in a rural setting. If you live in a rural setting, you're more likely to make things that you need, right? You can grow your own food, you can have livestock, sometimes you can make your own clothes, make your own butter, etc., etc. Whereas if you live in the city, you're not able to do that so much. And so you require the market economy to get those basic staples in your life, right? And so people living in a city are more likely to be buying goods than people living in rural areas, and especially consumer goods. And as we'll see, advertising will be a heavy factor in terms of the promotion of those types of goods. And just related to that point is the labor force changes. So if you were to look at this earlier period in 1880, about half of the population are classified as agricultural workers. So they're sort of like farmers. And if you get to that 1920 period, only about a quarter are farmers, right? So most of the others are working in factories, or they're working in other types of industries. They're working in these new professions that are coming along, like teaching, lawyers, these sorts of things, retail workers, distribution workers, etc. Okay, so related to that is the fact that not only are there more people, not only are they living in more urban areas, they're doing non-agricultural jobs, but people on average have more disposable income by 1920. And you can see here the number. On average, a person's earning $639 a year in 1920 compared to $147 in 1880. So what that means is even when you factor for inflation over those years, on average, the average person would have about 2.5 times as much income as opposed to that period 40 years before. And so what that means is they just have more dollars to buy things. And not just the discretionary or non-discretionary things. Like a non-discretionary thing would be like basic food or shelter, things like that. Discretionary spending, they have extra money in their pockets now, so they can buy things like chewing gum and cigarettes and other things that are not basic requirements for living. So it's an important factor, right? Because in order to participate in the market economy and to buy especially non-discretionary goods, discretionary and non-discretionary goods, you need to have the income supply there for people to do that. There are fundamental changes happening to the way goods are produced during this time period, starting in the 1860s and 70s. And this period is often referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution. And so what you see, a number of things that are happening here. One is just larger factories producing goods. So if you were to look before 1860 and count the number of factories, let's say that had 2,000 workers or more, there was one. Okay? It was a textile mill. If you were to go to 1900 and ask how many factories of 2,000 people or more working in them, it's over 70. So the economy is producing goods increasingly in these large factory settings. What facilitates that are changes in the energy basis for for these types of industrial production sites. Coal is increasingly replacing wood and water as the energy source. Coal is cheaper, it's more efficient in that sense. It also, of course, as we know today, produces harmful emissions, but those were not thought of at the time. The iron and steel industries are starting to develop at this time. And steel actually becomes important for even building bigger buildings, right? Using steel instead of wood or stone in that sense. You get something what's called the economies of scale production happening. So I'll explain it this way. So imagine you're in a little small production site, a little small factory, maybe employs 30 people, and you're able to produce a widget for 10 cents a widget. That's your sort of the cost of production. Now, that same widget in a factory with 1,000 people, that factory is probably able to produce that same widget for 5 cents as opposed to 10 cents. So the economies of scale of that production, the larger factory settings, the quicker sort of processing of the goods through the factory, the efficiencies of the production facilities, the more efficient use of coal and energy sources and all these things, it kind of comes together to make goods cheaper to produce. And so in order to be in this marketplace, to compete with those larger factories, you yourself have to become a larger factory if you want to actually go up against Procter & Gamble and Ivory Soap or whatever the case may be. So for that reason, this kind of production, this kind of economy is more what's called capital intensive. It means to start up a business, you have to start fairly big in order to be competitive in the marketplace for the cost of your goods. And so for that reason, and let's compare that when I mentioned the patent medicine industry before last week. To start a patent medicine firm, you often could do that with just a few people, right? I mean, Lydia Pinkham, one of the dominant patent medicine companies, I don't think ever had more than 100 employees, because the cost of the production facilities required to make the patent medicine were fairly simple. You did not require large factories to produce that good. And the basis of success in that business was, as we've talked about, was advertising oriented, right? It was not being able to produce the patent medicine at a very cheap price. That did not factor in terms of the success. But in this marketplace, in this economy, to be able to produce goods efficiently and successfully and competitively in that market, you had to have these larger factories. So you had to have large amounts of capital, large amounts of money to get these businesses set up. And so for that reason, you had what are called high fixed costs, right? You've spent all this money to build this factory, or you've taken out bank loans to do that. You've spent a lot of money on machinery, etc. And so you have these sort of high fixed costs, which means that you need to be able to be making money on a regular basis just to be able to pay for the costs of production that you have in place. Now, just taking up on that last point, one of the ways to explain the rise of advertising spending, and we're going to look at two ways, but the first one is coming from a Marxist perspective. And effectively, what that involves is that last point that I said, that you have these large factories producing goods at cheaper rates of cost. The goods can go out into the marketplace at a lower cost, which in theory makes it more accessible to people to buy those goods. That what happens in this marketplace is that you don't have lots and lots of small competitors competing. You tend to have a few dominant firms competing because of the large capital requirements to compete. And so you get a form of oligopoly capitalism, and that refers to a marketplace in which, say, a few businesses dominate. And so you have these large factories being able to produce goods at a cheap rate. They're being sort of sent out the factory door. And that seems great, right, from the standpoint of the business owners that are doing this. But what happens if people are not willing to buy those goods at the accelerated rate in which they're being produced by those factories? And this brings up the concept of realization, or the ability to absorb all of that production that's going out the door of the factory. And so what the Marxist critique says is that advertising is essentially a kind of an invention of the needs of oligopoly capitalism. That effectively advertising is engaged in heavily to basically create demand for goods, to create demand for goods that didn't exist before, but the advertising is a way to sort of make people believe that they would want to buy these things. And so it's a necessary component for oligopoly capitalism, because it's one thing to be able to produce goods very cheaply and very efficiently in factory settings, but it doesn't work unless all of those goods get absorbed or realized or taken up or bought by large numbers of people, by large numbers of consumers. Now, that's the Marxist explanation for this, for accounting for the increase in advertising spending. I tend to have a different explanation, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, but I'll just present a kind of counter argument to the Marxist critique with the example of the Bonsack machine. So the Bonsack machine was invented in the 1880s, and it was invented to machine roll cigarettes. At this time in the 1880s, cigarettes were generally not very popular. Far more people smoked cigars or pipe tobacco or chewed tobacco than they did cigarettes. Cigarettes, as I said, were hand rolled. It also meant it was a very slow method of production, right? It takes a lot of time to roll these cigarettes by hand. The Bonsack machine comes in, and some of these machines could actually machine roll 250,000 cigarettes in one day. It would take those hand rollers about a month to do that. So that's a phenomenal technological change in the industry, right? So suddenly these machines are now able to produce cigarettes at a faster rate than hand rollers could do. These cigarettes can then be put into the marketplace. Now, according to this critique, the Marxist critique, what we should see in the 1880s and 90s is a lot of advertising for cigarettes, so that people would, start turning to cigarettes and taking up that form of tobacco use compared to the other forms of tobacco use. But in fact, we don't see that. Cigarette sales don't really rise for another generation. It's not until the 1910s or 20s that you start to see big increases in cigarette sales. And it's not until then that you actually see a lot of advertising for cigarettes. So that's one way, that's one kind of critique of this Marxist perspective. Now, the approach that I tend to follow deals with a kind of power struggle, and to sort of understand the growth of advertising spending during this period. So essentially, think of it as a kind of a power struggle between the retailers, and I've got an example of a small store owner here around 1900 on the slide, between a power struggle between retailers like that guy and manufacturer advertisers, say like Procter and Gamble, okay? And it kind of goes like this, right? If you're this retailer, and imagine we're talking about this guy right on the screen here, and you sell all kinds of goods in your general store, and let's say you sell soap, and you sell kind of generic soap, right? It's kind of a no-name generic soap. We'll call it yellow cake soap. And you buy that from your supplier. Let's say you pay 5 cents per bar, and you're able to sell it for 10 cents. So you make a 5-cent markup, which is pretty good. Now, Procter & Gamble wants to get into that market. And they don't think they can really sell the soap to him for 5 cents and make a decent profit. They want to be able to sell it to him for 7 cents. And then he'd have to sell it for probably around 10 cents. So he's going to make less money from a Procter & Gamble product, and even one that's called Ivory soap. So his thinking is, well, why would I stock that soap? It's just actually not as profitable to me as the soaps that I'm already selling. Well, here's Procter & Gamble's response. They say, okay, well, we're not just going to be selling a generic Procter & Gamble soap. We're going to come up with this brand. We'll call it Ivory soap. And they do this in 1879. And then we're going to heavily advertise Ivory soap. And we're going to make all these wonderful claims about it. We're going to give this Ivory soap a kind of brand identity that are going to make people think that Ivory soap is a better soap than other types of soaps. And it's also going to make them feel good about cleanliness and about hygiene in general. And we're going to do this advertising extensively such that when people see the advertising in their magazines or newspapers, they're going to think, okay, when I go to the store, I'm not just getting soap, I'm going to get Ivory soap. So if they show up at this retailer's store and they say, yeah, I'll take some tea, I'll take some coffee, and I want to get some Ivory soap, and he says, well, I don't stock Ivory soap, their response might be, well, okay, I'll remember that the next time I go shopping. And it may be that I don't go to his general store, I go to another store that will carry Ivory soap. And that's what tends to happen, is that more of these small retailers have to stock these branded goods like Ivory soap because people are coming in the store wanting those. And if they don't get them, they may go elsewhere. And so this retailer then has to realize that in order to have the Ivory soap, he has to sell it. He sells it for 10 cents, but he paid 7 cents for it. So he's only making a 3-cent profit now. But it's a profit that he has to accept because of the power of the manufacturer, advertiser, like Procter & Gamble. It's their power through advertising, speaking directly to consumers. They create that power for the brand, and they effectively take away power from the retailer. And so what you see is over these decades is increasingly the power of manufacturers and advertisers, their power increases through the use of advertising and branding, and the power of retailers will deplete or decrease because of this. He may actually have the physical side of the store, but in fact, there's a certain kind of power that you can create through branding that will require him to take branded goods, even if it affords him less profit. All right, so that's the power struggle explanation between retailers and manufacturers, and it's one that I think is probably more credible, at least in terms of my own research. Okay, now imagine you're Kellogg's or Heinz or Procter and Gamble, and say it's 1900, and you're wanting to invest more in advertising because you realize it seems to have some success, and maybe even in terms of what I just said, in terms of getting power from retailers. And you're looking out at this marketplace and you're thinking, okay, well, how am I going to advertise now? And you might have, if you were doing this in 1854 and the entire US had 250 some odd newspapers, it might be an easier task, right, to pick which newspapers to advertise in. But what about in 1900? Now there are more than 2,000 newspapers across the United States. I'm not even counting magazines or weekly newspapers. These are daily newspapers. So you've got more than 2,000 daily newspapers across the U.S. You're also selling in Canada as well, so there's a whole bunch of others there. And you have to come up with some thinking here. Like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to place advertising in all these different newspapers, right? How am I going to understand which newspapers make the most sense for their readership, et cetera, et cetera? How am I going to know their advertising rates? Like, what am I going to be paying for these ads? How can I get the best price or the best deal for my advertising that I'll place? And how am I even going to know if we're in Philadelphia, let's say, where the company is based, and I want to advertise in Seattle newspapers? How am I even going to know if my ads actually ran the way that they were supposed to run based on what I paid for, right? Well, the answer to that, and we'll come back after the break, is that you're going to use advertising agents to do this work. All right? So we'll see you in a bit.